Phil just ate a giant piece of seaweed. Okay.
Okay, no.
Phil, I'm going to have to edit that out. That's like a huge spoiler for Mistborn.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Phil just
edit it out.
made a major...
I just spoiled the end of the book,
So, can't include that.
If that paused, that's why. So I'm gonna expose my fiance here.
Think hard
she
and long
hated-
about what you're about to say.
I
so-
know.
And I wanna read 500 books, and I wanna read 500 more. When I have read 1,000 books, then I am gonna read 1,000 more.
What is up, second pagers? This is Beyond the First Page with Phoebe, Isaac, and Phil, Book Club 10, where we will be discussing The Women by Kristen Hanna. I'm Phoebe.
And I'm Isaac.
I'm Phil.
And before we get started discussing The Women, just wanted to do a little housekeeping. If you like our podcast, please follow us on Spotify, subscribe to our YouTube, follow us on Instagram, and you can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I will also say that we will be talking about spoilers and major plot points throughout the podcast. So if you haven't read The Women and you plan to, we all recommend that you read that and then listen to the podcast afterwards so we don't ruin anything for you. And we're going to open with a question that I have actually surprised the boys with. And then we will get into talking about the book and end with some reviews. So to start us off, I wanted to each of us, instead of doing what fictional character would you be, I want to say what fictional character the siblings would be. So I will tell Phil, I will say what Phil's going to be. Phil will say what Isaac's going to be, and Isaac will say what I would be.
Out of any fictional character?
Any fictional character. So I'll go first, and I'll try to elaborate to give you guys.
Oh my gosh.
Just now we have the entire fantasy realm. Goodness.
I have Phil, and I would say this is pretty off the cuff as well. I will just also preface this with I've only read 1.5 of the Dune books. I could not get through them. Don't come at me. But I will say that I think Phil is Thufir Hawat, and he's the Mentat in Dune. And Mentats have the ability to make any calculation in their head, and they're like huge numbers guys. So they're big assets in the Dune world.
That's pretty nice. That's a good one. Isaac, I don't have yours.
I'll
yet.
go
Do you have
for
Phoebe's yet?
Phoebe's. So this is
Damn, quick.
Yeah. Well, in preparation for this, I was looking up some books that I've read with the female voice and from a female's perspective. So I'm gonna go with Phoebe. You are Lady Knight Kendralee Kell of Midland from the Protector of the Small series. It's a series by Tamara Pierce that I read as a teenager, and all her books have female protagonists, but this one in particular was the first one I read. She was a knight, and she didn't have to hide to be a girl, but she was the first girl to go through as a girl the whole time. Her hero, Alana, which is a different series, had to hide, so she kind of broke down some barriers there. She was always looking out for, the weak. She had a little pizzazz and spunk to her, so I think that would fit you pretty well.
Wow, that's so nice. Thank you. Oh, also to give Phil another second, by the way, this is 10 podcasts, and so I'm going to cheers you guys. This is wine that I put ice in, and Isaac has a Yingling Flight, which I didn't even know what that was. I think Phil's a coffee.
I don't know what that is either.
But cheers to us.
Congrats.
Cheers. What's our fun fact about 10 podcasts?
Oh,
we're like the only people to ever make it.
No one has made more than 10 podcasts ever. No, it's just, I think it's very small percentage make it to even one podcast, and then even a smaller amount make it to 10, obviously. So big milestone for us. So Phil.
I think Isaac would be Ellen Venture, who in the Mistborn trilogy is Vin's husband. He's very charismatic to the point where it's sort of annoying because you're not really sure why. No one has ever had a problem with Ellen Venture, but also sometimes he's in his own head and always trying to do the best thing, and so he sort of does nothing sometimes. So that's a character flaw a little bit. I think he overthinks a lot of things. Yeah, I think Isaac would be something like that. Someone charismatic, but also very almost to a detriment, concerned about morality and the right
I'll take
thing
that.
to do.
Thanks,
That's a
Phil.
really good assessment. Yeah. I like Ellen Venture
Sure
a
thing.
lot. I love that series too.
Yeah, great
Good,
series.
good on the fly, guys. I figured that would be a fun little test of how well you know the siblings or how well we know each other. So, Isaac, if you just want to tell us a little bit about the women and what we're getting into here.
Yep. So here is this book in 60 seconds, and this is The Women. This book follows the story of Frankie McGrath. She's a girl from Coronado Island, who joins the Army Nurse Corps after her brother is sent to Vietnam as a Naval Academy graduate. She has the intent of joining him over there and making her parents proud, especially her father, who has a wall of heroes in his office honoring the family history of military service. Right before she's supposed to leave for Vietnam, her whole family's informed that her brother has died in a helicopter shoot down over there. And while they're obviously crushed, she still has to go to Vietnam to serve. While overseas, Frankie makes lifelong friends and quickly learns about becoming a good nurse and a little about life and falling in love. She has several love interests over there and ends up signing on for a second year-long tour along with her new love, her brother's friend Rye, to continue her much-needed service. Upon her return to the States after her second tour, she finds she is very unwelcome back in the United States as a service member, both from the U.S. population as a whole and, more shockingly, from her own parents. This begins a tumultuous and difficult readjustment to civilian life, unaided by the news Rye has been killed in action. Story follows Frankie through her struggles of heartbreak and the crippling PTSD of her experiences in the Vietnam field hospitals.
Great. I think that really captured everything. And I picked this because Kristen Hanna tells a very compelling historical fiction story. And she wrote The Nightingale, which is a very popular book. The Nightingale is about World War II and the women that also participated in World War II. And I thought this would be a great way to learn about the Vietnam War, while also getting a fiction perspective as well. And so just to start us off and talking about historical fiction versus based on a true story and what we prefer as readers, I really wanted to learn more about the Vietnam War, and I don't know that I did by this book. I'll just come out and say it right away.
I don't know. I just think that part of the true story narrative to me is just very compelling. Historical fiction, I guess you could just, I think I'm a bit more critical on. I don't think I'm as critical on based on a true story because, okay, I mean, you had to do that. That's what happened.
Right.
It's definitely harder just to write a book because you don't have any direction. And I think that this story, would it have been based on a true story, would have turned out different. I think you don't have to deal with the fact that some characters are unreasonable.
Yeah. So kind of what you're saying is
but-
like, if I'm going to read about a historical event, I want it to be something that actually happened. I don't need to read a fictional
if
story.
you want to make it fantasy, I love fantasy. That's its own thing. I like fantasy based in history. I love the Temeraire series where it's the Napoleonic Wars, but there's dragons. I did know there weren't.
You weren't going to be
dragons
caught off
during
guard by
Napoleonic
that.
Wars. Right. Nothing gets past me.
Yeah. What about you, Isaac? Do you prefer a historical fiction or a based on a true story? And what's the difference?
Yeah,
to
I don't
you?
think I prefer one or the other. It just depends on what you want to read. I think that in the case of this book, if this had been so I guess before I get into that, I don't know if I've really read a lot of based on a true story books. I feel like the based on a true story is a lot of movies because they have to adapt the story to screen slightly and add dialogue. And maybe I'm just misunderstanding it, but like even Boys in the Boat or Unbroken, those two, I would call those nonfiction. Those were stories about the University of Washington rowing team and Louis Zamperini. So those were true stories. Everything in those books happened. So that's not based on a true story. There was no literary or storytelling licensing going on in there to incorporate that. Whereas their movies were based on a true story because they had to add all this extra stuff to make the story go.
Right.
So I don't have a problem with one or the other. I think that now getting back into this book, if this book had been a true story, I would have appreciated it much more. It would have made a lot more sense.
Yeah.
To me, it ended halfway. As soon as she got home from Vietnam, it no longer became historical fiction, because now
Right.
this was just a story about a girl going through a lot of shit in the 60s who had PTSD.
Yeah.
And isn't that historical fiction?
No, but that's
No,
like
because
saying
I think-
anything's historical fiction not based in the present.
Right.
Well, not based in the present, but in Earth with those events.
But that's like saying like the
I
Harry
think,
Harry
like,
Bosch
macro-
series is historical fiction because it's it being an LA cop in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And that's not historical.
Yeah.
All right.
So
okay,
that's
I guess,
not
I mean,
guess,
No.
maybe
right,
like
yeah.
you could redefine it.
I guess for historical fiction, it has to be based in a historical event,
Yeah.
and that has to be the driving
Yeah.
factor.
So like
That
in
makes
this
sense.
book, her in the Vietnam War, you seeing the inside life. You were seeing what Vietnam was like through the eyes of a fake person at real places, real army camps, real cities, real things that could have happened, but didn't necessarily happen that exact way. And I don't think I learned as much post her return home than I would have liked to, because there was a lot that happened. Like the assassination
Right.
of Martin Luther King is huge, and it's historical fiction. You
Yeah.
could do anything with that character. She could have been involved in that, and that I think would have been
Right.
a lot better story than the one that was told.
I mean, just to go off of that, she could have. I mean, the woman that she was closest with in the entire story was African American. She was Black, so she could have totally, tackled two.
And I thought those parts were interesting about how her brother was in the Black
Right.
Panthers, and that was a
But that would have not to be
point, Phoebe.
extremely harsh, but that would have required Kristen Hanna to do any amount of research. I mean, this book, I also came off of reading Empire of Pain, which was so well researched that this book, if you read the back credits, she said, I as a young author in the 70s or whatever, I had this idea and I wasn't ready to bring it to bear. And now I'm like, what were you doing between now and then? You didn't do any research. I could have Googled what was in the book. It did not require any kind of digging deep to come to this story. And it goes into our next point, like Isaac was saying, it stopped being historical fiction so much, in my opinion, because the minute she got home, it wasn't necessarily about her PTSD. It was about how she fell in love with this guy, thought he died, and then turns out actually he was just a douchebag, and that could have happened to anybody. I typically like historical fiction because I do enjoy that amount of romance, and I do like that thing that makes you keep reading on a topic that maybe doesn't interest you as much, but then you learn something along the way. And I wanted to talk to you guys about that too, to get a male perspective on that.
So this is something that I have been thinking about this a lot, and I took notes while I was reading this book so that I could be more insightful for the podcast, because I noticed that you guys took notes. So one of the notes that I kept taking was, I do not feel romance at all. I feel nothing from this book. I felt one piece of emotion in this entire book, and that was during the Vietnam War Memorial dedication, where she said, and finally I got thanked.
Right.
And finally
My
this happened.
parents
That is the
recognized
only
me.
source of emotion. And I like reading about romance. There's this section in Rick Riordan's book that I used to read when I was sad, where Leo falls in love with Calypso. Okay, that's my thing. And I think that's why I was so averse to the romantic aspect of this, because
It wasn't
like
well
Isaac
done.
said, I like learning about the war and the nurses in Vietnam and their heroicism and just how they were treated when they got back. But the romance was just like, here's this made up story that is written by someone who's not really able to write that well. ChatGPT could have written that. I've never read Kristen Hanna before. I tried The Nightingale and I couldn't get into it. That's probably on me though.
No,
But
I think she's known for just writing an interesting historical fiction. I really enjoyed The Nightingale because I think it gave a perspective to the French countryside during World War II, where they were truly invaded. Soldiers were coming into their home and making their homes their own. And that's a perspective of World War II I had never thought about before. So that was interesting to me because it was telling it through that perspective. This was not a perspective I hadn't heard before, but it could have been. It easily could have been, But I wanted to hear your perspective, Isaac, too, because I'd kind of heard Phil's before on the idea of how much romance or how much love are you as a 30-year-old male looking for in any novel that you're reading?
I don't know if I'm looking for romance in any book that I read, but I do think the idea of love is so ingrained in human nature that it's tough to tell a story without it at all. There's always going to be some sort of emotional connection that a character feels, or honestly, I think if you didn't have it, you would be like, this is robot. You would never trust that the character is real. But I by no means necessarily go seeking it, but I think it's always there. I do think, and this is how I came up with finding the character that I said you would be, is I did some serious thinking about books I had read with a strong female lead. And there are some great books out there with strong female leads. That is not what I'm saying at all. And I'm trying to say this to not sound as least sexist as possible. But I don't think I like the women's perspective of a love story. I don't know if I've ever read a love story with the story's sole purpose of being a love story, but I did not like it.
So you don't know if you like it from a male perspective either. It's more the fact that like
you don't like love stories.
I
haven't gone that way.
Trying to think
of a love
story
story from the male.
Well, Isaac, what about Heart's Invisible Furies?
True.
Whoa.
Whoa.
Yeah, I didn't mind it. And
Maybe
that's from the male.
I thought about this too. There's 4 types of Greek love that I think are actually really helpful in this. There's storge, which is familial love. There's eros, which is this just romantic love. Then there's philia, which is a friendship love. And then there's agape, which is an unconditional sort of very hard to understand unless it's so deep. And I think that you really need some element of one of those in a book, and it needs to be realistic. And I think that maybe this one was so just eros from the female perspective that it's really hard to relate to. I think that I am fine with, I'm thinking an easier one to think of, Isaac. I don't know if you've read any of the classics, but if it's a classics written by a woman, it's usually a pretty strong love story where you have Wuthering Heights, Pride and Prejudice, North and South. They're like love stories written by women. Emma, even
I have.
Yeah,
I'll have to
there's
do
a ton of them,
for the podcast. I'll have to do some self research.
You should read Pride and Prejudice.
Wuthering Heights. Well, no, I hated
Pride and Prejudice is my favorite book.
But even you guys,
like probably of all time.
Even you guys saying, "Oh, these are all great love stories." Maybe it's just a love story. Maybe I was being unfair to the woman perspective, because even just hearing that, I'm like, "Oh, I have absolutely no interest in that." But I'm a pretty romantic guy, so like Phil said, I don't mind that stuff. But I guess maybe I do, because I do not look forward to reading that.
I think
no, you like good writing,
right?
That there is a way to write it in a way that's compelling.
I think we should follow up on whether or not Isaac is emotionless or he just has not found a good love story.
I think so I misinterpreted I misinterpreted your original thoughts about this, Isaac, because we had talked before this podcast about it. I thought you just didn't like books from the female perspective written by a man.
No, I have no problem with that.
This was not written by a man.
I know, but for some reason, so I had like all these books written down.
I love a strong female lead. Always have. I was reading Alana, and I was reading all those Tamara Pierce books about sex and women having their periods in like 4th grade. It's like, what the hell is going on in this book?
Yeah.
Dad was like, this is good.
He really was. It's funny because I was like, this book
you were like, this is not
this book is way too girly. Isaac was like, I love these. So I do think that's funny.
Yeah, so we could talk about this forever. We've explored that a little bit with Isaac, and I think we've just established you like good writing. So that's great.
And that maybe I've never read a love story.
Potentially. The Rosie Project also would be a good one.
It's true. I think that this was so unrealistic. She abandoned her entire life for 6 months to just be in love. That's not a compelling love story because that's not love.
Yeah,
That's
but
obsession. Maybe you don't like obsession stories where people can quit their life.
But I do think that leads us into our next topic, because there is an element there that it's obviously for Phil and I, and Isaac maybe too, hard to understand, which is PTSD. And I think the issue that Kristin Hannah was trying to get at there with, she didn't know how to handle her pain. The VA was turning her away because she was a woman, and she was living a very troubled life and existence after this. But again, and Phil, you mentioned this, her troubles didn't really manifest until, it was circled around the death of, at the time she thought Rye died.
I think so I've thought about this too. Either Kristin Hannah is a genius, and this was really, really well written, or she missed the ball. I tend to think she missed the ball, and I'll explain it.
Like, you think she was like
Phoebe
meta?
Saying, yeah, I don't know too much about PTSD. Maybe you're just unable to handle emotional scenarios, and you can't really relate. You can't relate to people why this is affecting you so much. And that could have been sort of her. She was good. And then this thing that other people would have been able to handle. I mean, it would have been tough, but they would have been able to handle. She was just off. Could not deal with any more emotional trauma because of all of this stuff that she was shoving down. That is a very generous reading of the book. What I actually read, without really giving her benefit of the doubt, it just seemed like she wasn't troubled until something romantic fell apart. And then she was very troubled. And I think what convinced me that this is the case too is how Kristin Hannah ended the book, which was fucking awful. It was so bad. It really ruined the entire thing.
Yeah, it did.
Because she was fine now that she found love. Oh, happy ending. It was right after the Veterans Memorial where you thought that was going to be the clincher. The thank you was going to be the clincher. But no, it was like her finding this man
that she thought was dead.
I also didn't love, it reminded me a lot of Megatron Keep Coming Back, just how many POWs. I don't think that was the case. I think that a lot of POWs died.
And never came back.
Or people who were missing just never were found. And it seemed that like they kept coming back for her.
I think to your point, Phil, you're then minimizing people who truly never got closure on their loved ones' lives lost.
Yeah, so I think that as far as PTSD goes, that I think your generous reading was what she was trying to go for. And I don't think she missed the ball on PTSD manifesting itself in all these different ways, because I think one of the reasons that it's so difficult is that there is no, like, everyone is going to handle it differently. So there is no set way that people can both cope and that it shows up in all those different other things. And that's what makes it so challenging. And I think that exposed that, and that was fine. I think my problem comes back to the love story portion of it, where it was just a love story that was not good. And that made the reader be annoyed at this whole PTSD story. Whereas I think that to go back to our first point of historical fiction, you could have told a PTSD story. You could have told a love story. You could have told a love story between her and her two friends, the other Greek love, between the love of your friends, whatever that one was. That would have been an excellent story, because her friends were badasses. Her friends were there all the time. They were involved in all this other stuff, showing 3 different ways how these amazing women came back from a war that was fucking awful and went on with their lives. One that really struggled with her love and personal life. One that you didn't really know that much about, but threw herself into civil rights, which was a huge issue at the time. Still is a huge issue, but like at the forefront of the civil rights issue. And one who changed careers completely and was living the American dream. And you could have shown all three, still told a love story.
So inspiring.
And had historical fiction, hit all these other stuff, and got closure at the end with the wall. You didn't need the guy there. It ruined the closure. The thank you from her dad was could have been the best part of the book. And maybe, honestly, could have saved it.
If she had just not included the Jamie, you're still like, this would have been something that I maybe would have recommended.
The dad had said, you know what?
Too.
You did serve, and we're proud of all our family's military service. And the book had ended, you would have been like, damn, maybe there is a farm in Montana filled with women nurses. Like, maybe this is
Yeah, and I do think all of her efforts on that front were good. I think if there was any quote that I would have to tell anybody before reading this book, it would be, and this is a quote in the book, that was the starting and ending point in life. Love, the journey was everything in between. And you sort of know what you're getting yourself into with that. Kristin Hannah really wanted this to be a love story. Yeah. And it's funny because the two things I took notes on that I thought was unrealistic, one was the love. The second, though, I ended up not feeling this way by the end of the book, and that was sort of her father's personal. I think that was I don't think everyone shared that, how like a father wouldn't be, and maybe we just have a great dad, so we don't know that, but a father wouldn't be proud of the daughter for doing the exact same thing.
I think there was not for me enough. That was unrealistic that he would have ever come forward to say that to her at that juncture, that they would have flown across the country and done that based on how Kristin Hannah set it up in the book. I think if there had been more of a lead up to that and more struggles, again, like you're saying, if you had focused on these three women and their struggles instead of this love story, I think you could have gotten there for me with her dad thanking her. I like that happened, but I think it was also a little bit unrealistic based on the story that Kristin Hannah told that the father would have done that. I think that really leads us into overall ratings for the book then. Phil, what was your rating?
Well, let me explain the rating system.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a 3-star, sort of like the Michelin stars, where a 3 is would read again, 2 is would recommend to a friend, great book, 1 is good, I finished it, nothing special, don't regret it, and then 0 is not a good book. I personally rated it a 1.5 because I do think that the aspect of the woman nurses in Vietnam is an interesting enough learning experience for the first half of the book that I had that I wouldn't recommend it to a friend, but I don't regret reading it.
I gave it a 1.5 as well for the really cool topic. And then just the other added thing in there, I don't think just women service members in general, I've never read a book or watched a movie or anything about highlighting women in service. And I think that is really cool that she tried to do it. And for the first half of the book, she did. And it's a topic that should not go. There are a lot of stories out there, I'm sure, of a lot of heroic women like that.
Yeah. I'm a 1. I think for me, you look at all these ways for women to take a step forward, and this was not one of them. And I wish that it could have been painted in a light where, exactly like you said, Isaac, there was 3 women who did an amazing, very heroic, patriotic thing, and it got turned into a sniveling girl from Coronado Island who fell in love with an idiot. And it was a miss for me, and so it was a 1. But I did want to grab really quickly. Hang on one second. There was a part in the book. I'm going to read something now, which is always terrifying. So it's in a country where youth is adored. We lost ours before we were out of our 20s. We learned to accept death there, and it erased our sense of immortality. We met our human frailties, the dark side of ourselves face to face. The war destroyed our faith, betrayed our trust, and dropped us outside the mainstream of our society. We still don't fully belong. I wonder if we ever will. Winnie Smith, American Daughter, Gone to War. And I thought that was a powerful quote. Just thinking about the different things that men and women went through coming back. Just in general, how hard it was for soldiers to come back from Vietnam, but specifically for women. And I think all of what we said, that did give you a glimpse. This book did give you a glimpse of that.
Yeah, it was crazy, the VA telling her there were no women in Vietnam.
Right. So I think that brings us to what books you would like if you liked The Women by Kristen Hanna. And Phil, I'd love to hear what book you thought of.
Yeah, so I don't read a lot of historical fiction, and I don't want to keep re-recommending the Century Trilogy by Ken Follett. So the book that I would recommend is Trust by Hernan Diaz. It's not really a historical fiction, but it does take place in the Roaring Twenties. And it's almost, I would say it's a historical fiction. It's very close. It actually won the Pulitzer last year alongside Demon Copperhead, which is by Barbara Kingsolver. And then, just at the risk of being trite, The Book Thief is great too. That was the only other sort of historical fiction that I could think of, but definitely a winner there.
Yeah. What about you, Isaac?
So I went the other way. This is a nonfiction book that is more of a love story. And actually, I think this was included on our Valentine's Day post of mine. That's how it shows you how limited love story books I read. But this is Good Husbandry by Kristen Kimmel. And it's a love story. It's how her and her husband met. And then it's a love story between them. And then it's a love story between her and falling in love with farming. And then with her and her husband and her family and the land.
Yeah, that seems right up your alley for the only kind of love story that you could maybe stomach, Isaac. Okay, my recommendation is Island of the Sea Women. It's by Lisa See. And it is about women who are diving off of the coast of Korea. And it's a village run by women. Like, women are the matriarchy in their community. And it spans World War II and the Korean War. But it is an extremely fascinating story about women, their friendships, women empowerment. And I would highly recommend it. If you like the women, or even if you were looking for something a little bit more, that's a great book for you.
What are you reading now, Phoebe?
I am reading, so I just read A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. I love George Saunders. He wrote Lincoln in the Bardo. He wrote 10th of December, Fox 8, and he is just absolutely fabulous. Swim in the Pond in the Rain isn't like any other book I've read. So I would just say, if you're looking to think about the things you're reading more critically, or if you're trying to get into writing, this is a great book for you. It goes through 8 Russian short stories, and then George Saunders offers commentary at the end of each of those short stories. So there's some by Tolstoy, Chekhov. There's a bunch of well-known Russian authors, and it's very interesting. So that's what I just read, and I loved it.
I just read The Combat Codes by Alexander Darwin. It's a good fantasy if you like Jade City by Fonda Lee, or anything martial artsy, fantasy, steampunk. Good. I'm also reading The Edible Economics by Ha-Joon Chang, and it's a very accessible pop economics book. It's so accessible. I'm not really learning anything about economics. I'm learning more about food, but that's how he sort of introduces the concept of economics. So it's good.
Cool. And I'm reading 1941, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann. It is a just book about pre-Columbusing, discovering, in quotes, North and South America, and just what civilizations could have looked like. Pretty insightful, and a lot of cool stuff that is unconventional to kind of how most people think of it. You would like this if you liked The Earth is Weeping or Of Wolves and Men. And The Earth is Weeping is by Peter Cozens, and Of Wolves and Men is by Barry Lopez. All three are pretty wide-arching and different. The first two about Native Americans, and the third about man and canines relationships across history.
Interesting. So then also in 2 weeks, we are reading The Hunter. And in case you have not read The Searcher yet, I personally, having read The Searcher and now started The Hunter, really recommend that you read The Searcher, because the characters are very developed in The Hunter based on what The Searchers are already laid out. So really recommend that you read The Searcher. And Isaac, do you want to tell us a little bit about The Hunter?
Sure. In The Hunter, we continue the story of ex-American cop Cal Hooper in his attempted isolation in rural Ireland that has been anything but a relaxing retirement. Just when he thinks the excitement of searching for his new pseudo-ward Trey's brother from French's previous book is over, her father shows back up with a rich Englishman in a scheme to find gold in their town. Cal has to do everything he can to protect Trey, but she doesn't want protecting. She wants revenge.
Dun dun. Now, this is a good one. I liked The Searcher. I think you guys, at least Isaac, you had said you had liked it as well. So
we'll talk about it next week.
Excited to talk with all of you.
spoilers.
So as we come to a close, just reminding you to call someone you love. Maybe that'll be your sibling. Tell them about a good book that you've recently read. Go to your library or use your Libby app and pick up a good book. And until next time, stay classy, second pagers. See you guys.
See you guys.
See ya.
5